My name is Teresa Liu from the Secretariat of Asian Bankers Association, ABA. I'll be your MC today. On behalf of the Asian Bankers Association and Hatton National Bank from Sri Lanka, allow me to welcome you today. Thank you very much for your kind presence in this year's 37th ABA General Meeting and Conference, the first ABA conference being held virtually. We are now ready to officially open this important event. To begin the opening ceremony, may I invite ABA Chairman, Mr. Jonathan Ellis, to give the welcome statement. Mr. Ellis, please.
Good afternoon to most and a good day to some. Members of the ABA Advisory Council, members of the ABA Board of Directors, fellow ABA members and bankers, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Asian Bankers Association, I'm delighted to welcome all of you to today's 37th ABA conference, the first ever virtual gathering of ABA members, associates, colleagues, and friends. Thank you very much for participating in this important event. Indeed, we meet at a time of profound and complex challenges, both in the economic and financial landscapes. The COVID-19 pandemic is damaging economies across the world, including financial markets and institutions in all possible dimensions. For banks in particular, the pandemic generates multifaceted crises, mostly through increases in default rates. This is likely to be worse in developing economies with poor financial market architecture. The pandemic could substantially threaten the performance, survival, and growth of banks in developing countries, particularly in those where banks play a dominant role in the economy. Undoubtedly, the economic shock has been sharp and severe. Governments and central banks have acted swiftly, deploying an arsenal of fiscal and monetary stimulus packages to buoy cash-strapped companies, provide liquidity to financial markets, and aid to millions of people who have lost their jobs. With this, banks are working as a de facto delivery system, doling out cash for those in need. However, with no clear end in sight and the virus still rampant, banks are acutely aware that how they respond to the crisis now will determine how they will rebuild for the future. Providing support to governments and customers is crucial during this crisis, but this will require banks to deploy the tools they have developed since the 2008 financial crisis to lead a coherent and extensive response to uncharted territory. While the banking sector has successfully navigated the immediate pressures of the COVID-19 crisis, most of the world is still coming to grips with the widespread impact of COVID-19. Hence, the global banking industry is facing the monumental challenge of helping to keep the economy running during lockdowns and to help it recover while the pandemic is happening. As thoughts turn to a world beyond the immediate crisis, a strong banking sector will be needed for a strong recovery. Looking beyond the immediate threat and ongoing effects of COVID-19 pandemic is difficult. In a low interest rate, low profitability environment where the risk of a third or even fourth wave remains, banks will need to continue playing a significant role in shaping the recovery and helping their customers rebuild their financial security and business health. And in parallel, adapting their operating models and ways of working to ensure the best efficiency and resiliency measures that will result in an agile organization to help them weather the recovery. Providing support to government and customers is crucial during this crisis. And this will require banks to deploy the tools that they have developed since the 2018 financial crisis to lead a coherent, extensive response to uncharted territory. I strongly believe that the ABA will have a role to play in helping our members address the challenges before us. Indeed, the importance of business networking to encourage greater interaction among individual bankers and banking sectors in the Asian region will be crucial to enable us to go forward. As members of the ABA, we all have a shared future, just like passengers sitting on the same boat. We therefore need to help each other to address challenges on the basis of consultation and coordination and pursue common development. We need to share our insights, build consensus, and contribute to promoting development and prosperity in Asia and the world. We all have our own comparative strengths, and our economics are highly complementary. Greater openness and deeper cooperation within the region will be crucial for the sustained fast growth of Asian economies. Deeper regional integration under the current circumstances can help us better leverage our comparative strengths. We need to jointly break new ground in the innovation-driven development. After years of fairly fast growth, Asian countries now face the challenge of shifting from old drivers of growth to new ones, and we must rely on innovation to foster the latter. As the new round of global technological revolution and industrial transformation unfolds, we must seize the opportunities to tap into our advantages in human capital and market potential to intensify cooperation on innovation and accelerate the upgrading of the banking sector. We need to make our business environment open, clear the way for unimpeded flow of factors of innovation, and share innovation resources and outcomes, setting the stage for the steady progress of Asia's innovation-driven development. Our conference this year will hopefully provide us the opportunity to examine how various challenges and trends we are seeing today are coming together to influence the future of banking. I therefore expect that we will have an interesting and productive exchange of views on these important issues, and I look forward to everyone's active participation in today's discussions. In closing, I would like to once again thank all the session speakers and panelists for being with us today and in the next 3 days. With their valuable insights on the issues at hand and the inputs from all delegates, the deliberations that will take place during this year's conference will be a great learning for all of us. Let me also take this opportunity to thank the members of the ABA Advisory Council, Board of Directors, and my fellow members for the tremendous support towards all ABA activities. In particular, my sincere gratitude to the ABA Secretariat for ensuring continuity of ABA activities instead of taking a backseat on account of the present situation and making sure that we have remained connected online, which has helped to continue with our policy advocacy work and now helped us to organize for the first time an online ABA conference, and probably one with the biggest audience ever. Further, attendance of this conference entails no cost, and I have no doubt the sessions today and the next 3 days have been carefully selected for its relevance and will be of immense value to all of us who are attending. Based on the success achieved at the policy advocacy meetings and now this conference, we will also consider further training opportunities and knowledge sharing across member countries. The Hatton National Bank remains firmly committed to support ABA activities and did agree to host the 2020 conference in Sri Lanka, which unfortunately was not possible. HNB is now willing to come forward to host the conference in 2022, should circumstances permit, and of course subject to the decision of the Board of Directors. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you all once again and wish you all a fruitful and productive conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Alice, providing us a glimpse of what to expect will be discussed during the conference, especially in terms of the current and near-term challenges faced by banks in the region, and what the ABA and its members can do individually and collectively to meet these challenges. We now invite Mr. Ingjun Hwang, Chairman of Line Bank Taiwan, to make the special address. Mr. Hwang, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you for having me. It is an honor to be invited as the 2021 Asian Bankers Association keynote speaker. As kindly introduced, I'm Ingjun Hwang, and I am the chairman of Line Bank Taiwan and Global Chief Investment Officer at G Holdings. Line and G Holdings, two major tech companies in Japan, recently completed a business integration in March of this year. We strive to be a world-leading tech company by integrating our respective technologies and strengths. Today, I want to share with you some of my thoughts and perspective about what the new normal in banking in Asia means. I want to discuss the digital changes that are working their way across all industries and have driven the development of Line Financial Services. And then finally, I will share with you some of the ways that Line and other banks can respond to this new normal. It goes almost without saying that there has been an increase in digital everything. This pandemic, which is now headed towards its third year, has and continues to accelerate the adoption of digital in all industries and services. The impact of this trend of digitalization will be a defining pillar in the new normal. For example, in the payment space, digital payment adoption has accelerated because of the pandemic. In Japan, from 2018 to 2020, the total volume of digital payment rose 25 times to 4.2 trillion yen, driven by increases in users and the number of shops accepting cashless payment. The mirrors the situation globally, where digital payment continues to accelerate across the world, with Asia being a crucial contributor to growth. We see digital and mobile wallet capturing up to 33% of volumes at point of sales by 2024. So these change in the retail payment landscape are tangible and significant. But the pandemic has also accelerated other changes facing banks, particularly around how customers handle processes and interact with their bank. For markets where bank branches are dominant, the result of continued lockdowns and restrictions has been the sharp consumer shift away from branches. In Japan, which relies heavily on bank branches, the number of branches has been falling as consumers increasingly take care of their banking needs remotely. Many banks are designing more digital-driven banking centers where customers can handle large portion of their needs with light assistance. The same trend is occurring across the world. The question is, what is driving this? The pandemic accelerated the trend, but the underlying drivers of change in consumer behavior were well established beforehand. A large part of that change has been from smartphone use. Smartphones have changed the behavior of everyone everywhere, as people being between the age of 16 and 64 spend on estimated 3.5 hours per day on their mobile devices. McKinsey estimates that a third of young people, or Generation Z, in Asia spend 6 hours or longer on their phone every day. My 20-year-old son is inseparable from his phone, but somehow he never used his phone to call me. The smartphone impact banking in two ways. First, with the smartphone becoming so prominent, the channel to access and speak to younger customers has changed. For example, people are not watching as much TV, and the change is particularly apparent with young people. They are more likely to search extensively online for reviewers and informations. How young people discover new services, including banking, has shifted significantly and impacts how they choose the companies and services they will support. Second, smartphones have widened the field of disruptors for all industries, including financial services. Customer-centric startups have dramatically shifted their expectation. In most markets, consumers can find cheaper, faster, and digital-first ways to do things. What do these changes have to do with bank and financial institutions? Let me share with you how Line sees these global changes. With everyone spending more and more time on their smartphones, Line has made its focus life online. For Line, that means creating a platform for our 188 million global users to empower their whole day. Already our users chat, hail rice, stream music, and use telehealth. We wanted to provide them more. Finance and banking are integral part of the daily life, especially payment. So it makes sense for this to be a major cornerstone of LINE platform. We are especially excited about the bank project. 3 of them have launched already. Until recently, finance and banking were highly regulated businesses with little competition. For decades, most markets had a limited number of providers. Given how important to daily life payments and banking are, customers had little choice. Customers had to follow the framework of the institutions, which means going to a branch during business hours, filling out paperwork and enduring cumbersome processes and waiting. Banks offer customers products and services that banks wanted to offer, not those which customers were seeking. However, as I mentioned before, with new entrants offering exciting new products which consumers want, from low interest loan to no commission transactions, the situation is starting to change. And these new entrants have changed the paradigm to focus on users. LINE, too, has approached its suite of financial services in the same way, user first. We believe that means creating services that are convenient and uncomplicated for our users, so that the financial life is only a finger away from them 24/7. For LINE's financial companies, this philosophy dictates everything from products offered to service design. LINE is focused on offering what users enjoy: 24-hour access, no paper document, low fees, and intuitive interface. One example of how we have done this is at LINE Bank Taiwan, launched April this year. We figured LINE Bank to be simple to use with all process through LINE, eliminating the need to go to a bank branch. Account opening, from identity check to choosing a PIN number, takes only a matter of minutes. For the first time in Taiwan, we provide free transfers from bank users to their LINE friend without having to know bank details or mobile phone numbers. In addition, various types of remittance services, such as QR code remittance and split bill, are supported. LINE Bank Taiwan is just the start of our fintech business in Taiwan, with the number of bank accounts now reaching in almost 300,000. We strive to be #1 mobile bank in Taiwan by providing the best user experience and benefits. The philosophies are also reflected in our other product offering. LINE BK in Thailand is another example. LINE BK doesn't require mandatory submission of payslip or employment proof for loan products. Using internal scoring models to supplement users' data from the LINE ecosystem, we can offer comparative rates while widening access. As a result, LINE BK has reached over 3 million accounts with a loan balance of over Japanese yen 30 billion yen since the service release. We believe that this kind of user-first focus will define the new normal for financial institutions in Asia. In this new normal, the target will shift to creating services that delight users rather than simply providing infrastructure. LINE is also focused on democratizing finance using technology to realize low cost and high efficiency services to benefit our customers. This is happening across the industry. I am including a graph I saw this week about how new entrants have used new ways doing things to make remittance easier and brought down the cost for all. Similarly, in broadening finance, Line challenges the legacy system and practices which were just good enough but were not user-friendly. In doing so, we aim to lower the barriers to users and broaden their access to financial services. In another example of changes, Line builds its own proprietary scoring models in each of our main countries. With the users' consent, our in-house AI technology analyzes data from Line's extended services to create a score. Of course, scoring models take time to properly calibrate. However, we have found that using our own data in combination with other established scoring models provide a higher power than traditional models alone. This allows Line Financial Services to more accurately predict risk and in some cases provide a more attractive rate to the customers, returning some of the value to them. Other examples from Line platform include Line blockchain and AI technology. These technologies, especially blockchain, can be deployed for internal processes, creating further efficiency. Line's AI division has exciting new development which we deploy to create smoother user experience. eKYC solutions have reduced cumbersome manual processes for both users and us. Further, we have built a customer service function using AI-enabled chat functions at Line Bank Taiwan. The 24/7 service centers allows customers to handle their banking queries on their own time frame, not limited bank opening hours. This chat service has been able to handle about 83% of a customer service consultation. Using technology helps to reduce the cost base, and we can pass those savings onto our customers in the form of comparative product offering. So what does the new normal look like for banks across Asia? As I have discussed, the next period of normal will be characterized by further digitalization, rapidly shifting customers' expectations, and competition from new services. It is imperative that we put customers and users at the center in order to develop relevant services and products for the future. In closing, I want to leave you with a personal story. When we were setting up Line Bank Taiwan, I was talking with our joint venture partner, an executive at one of the biggest banks in Taiwan. I was asking him, why do you want to make another bank when you have already one of the largest banks? He told me, you and I use a big bank and fill in the form in the bank branches, but my children will not. His perspective made me think. Over my 30-year career, I have seen a lot of changes across banking and the financial industry. Without a doubt, banks must continually adapt to a new normal and evolve with users as their lives changes. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Chairman Hwang, for the insightful and highly informative presentation. and for sharing with his ideas and experience on how technology helps financial intermediaries to reach distant and diversified markets, particularly during these extraordinary times characterized by global disruptions, which call for measures to ensure sustainable business growth. The opening ceremony has now come to an end, and we are ready to begin with the conference proper. May we now invite the chairman of session 1, Mr. Eugene Acevedo, President and CEO of Rizal Commercial Banking Corporation from the Philippines, to please take the floor.
Good afternoon and good morning. Welcome to session 1, responding to challenges and disruptions in a changing global ecosystem. With the pandemic continuing its devastating impact on global markets, countries around the world are intensely focused on transforming their economic base and preparing for what appears to be a long, tough journey ahead. This session will feature 3 eminent speakers who will be later joined by 3 distinguished panelists. They will share their narratives on the challenges and disruptions brought about by the pandemic on their respective communities and their efforts to find innovative solutions and to exploit new opportunities in the emerging environment. Our first speaker is Dr. Donghyun Park of the ADB. Dr. Park is currently Principal Economist at the Economics and Research Department. His department handles data analysis and database development and management to enhance the effectiveness of ADB's aid and contribution to a country's development strategy. He also plays a leading role in the production of Asian Development Outlook, ADB's flagship annual publication. Prior to ADB, he was then a tenured associate professor of economics at Nanyang Technological University. Dr. Park has a PhD in economics from the UCLA, and his main research fields are international finance, international trade, and development economics. Dr. Park pre-taped his presentation, and we will now show the video.
I would like to thank the organizers of the 37th ABA General Meeting and Conference for inviting me to speak at this important event. Today, I will be making a presentation on ADB's view of Asia's short-term economic outlook. My presentation will be based largely on Asian Development Outlook, or ADO 2021. The ADO is ADB's annual flagship economic report. It is published twice a year in April and again in September. Amid the COVID-19 pandemic's ups and downs, developing Asia is experiencing a strong economic recovery, although it is an uneven economic recovery. Year-on-year GDP growth in Q4 2020, please look at the white dots in the chart, improved relative to year-on-year growth in Q1 to Q3, the yellow dots, in 8 of the region's 10 largest economies. The fourth quarter improvement was especially robust in developing Asia's 2 largest economies, namely China and India. The improvements came on both the domestic and external front, meaning that developing Asia's recovery is broad-based and well-balanced. Contributions to growth came from private consumption. Look at the blue bars, and those contributions became either less negative or turned positive in 7 of the 10 economies. The contribution from investment, look at the orange bars, also improved in 7 of the 10 economies. On the external front, net exports, or the gray bars, were a bigger boost to growth in Q4 in 7 of the 10 economies. external demand for manufacturing products contributed to a rebound of net exports in China, Korea, Singapore, and Taipei, China. Let us now look at the financial conditions of developing Asia. Due to the economic recovery, as well as substantial monetary and fiscal policy support, financial conditions and risk sentiment in the region continued to improve. Now, if you look at the left-hand chart, the left-hand chart documents the continuing narrowing of risk premiums in developing Asia's bond markets. Also, we don't show it here, but equity or stock markets also showed gains, and FDI and portfolio capital inflows into the region continued. Now let's look at the right-hand chart, right side chart, which shows currency movements. Most regional currencies strengthened or appreciated against the US dollar since the fourth quarter of 2020, but a few currencies depreciated. So appreciation is the general rule since fourth quarter of 2020, but there were some depreciations. The currencies that depreciated include the Lao PDR KIP, the Myanmar Kyat, the Sri Lanka Rupee, and also several Central Asian currencies. By the way, in March 2021, there were growing concerns over rising bond yields. Developing Asia's short-term economic outlook is positive, but there are substantial differences across regions and countries. If you look at bottom left, you will see that developing Asia shrank or contracted by 0.2% last year in 2020, but this year in 2021, the region is expected to rebound strongly, growing by 7.3% before moderating to 5.3% next year in 2022. By way of comparison, developing Asia grew by 5.0% in 2019 before the COVID-19 outbreak. So to a large extent, the exceptionally high growth rate we forecast for this year, 7.3%, reflects a large base effect. In other words, the fact that we had an exceptionally bad year last year. Now, if you look at the bottom right, excluding the NIEs or the rich newly industrialized economies of Korea, Taipei, China, Hong Kong, China, and Singapore, the growth rates are, of course, higher than for the entire region. Now, focusing on some key specific economies such as PRC, PRC grew by 2.3% last year in 2020, and this year it's expected to grow strongly by 8.1% before moderating to 5.5% next year. Turning to India, India shrank or contracted by 8.0% last year, but it is expected to grow by 11% this year before slowing down or moderating to 7.0% next year. For the ASEAN region or Southeast Asia, the region shrank by 4% last year, but it is expected to grow by a healthy 4.4% this year before accelerating further to 5.1% next year. Another way to document the divergent recovery path within developing Asia is to look not at GDP growth rates, but to look at GDP levels. The chart on the left shows that for developing Asia as a whole, after a mild contraction last year, the rebound in regional growth this year and next year will still leave GDP below its pre-pandemic trend. In other words, developing Asia's recovery will be incomplete. Within developing Asia, the GDP trajectory for China, which is shown in green in the second panel, looks quite strong. There was no decline last year, and GDP will get quite close to trend by next year, 2022. That's a sharp contrast with India, which is shown in blue in the third chart. India experienced a sharp contraction in 2020. So despite the expected sharp rebound this year, GDP remains well below its pre-pandemic trend. For the rest of developing Asia taken together and shown in purple on the right hand chart, the contraction last year was not so sharp, but at the same time, the recovery is also quite modest. Developing Asia's short-term economic outlook is clearly positive. The region's strong recovery is powered by the robust recovery of global trade, as well as some progress in fighting the COVID-19 pandemic, in particular, some progress on the vaccination front. Nevertheless, downside risks still outweigh upside risks, and of course, the biggest negative risk remains a negative trajectory of the COVID-19 pandemic. There are other risks as well, in particular, persistent geopolitical tension between the US and the PRC. Before I move on to the special theme chapter on financing a green and inclusive recovery, let me introduce some key updates from ADO Supplement July 2021. As I said earlier, ADO's two main reports are published in April and September, but we do publish much smaller supplements, just a few pages long, in July and again in December. The key new development since April is, of course, a big new COVID-19 wave which has hit the region. The left-hand chart, the black line, shows the evolution of COVID-19 cases in developing Asia since last year. After peaking in September, the number of cases declined steadily until February this year, but then it surged again in March and April, driven largely by India and South Asia, and driven partly by variants such as the Delta variant. Developing Asia's COVID-19 cases peaked in May this year, but has declined since May. However, some regions, especially Southeast Asia, has continued to see an increase in cases. There are major outbreaks in many Southeast Asian countries, including Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, here in the Philippines, as well as Vietnam. The right-hand chart shows that many developing Asian countries are making progress in vaccination, but the region as a whole is still a long way off from achieving herd immunity. We just saw that developing Asia suffered a major new wave of COVID-19 cases. However, the impact of the new COVID-19 wave on GDP growth forecasts has been quite limited. As you can see in this slide, there's a slight downgrade for this year from 7.3% in April to 7.2% in July, and a slight upgrade next year from 5.3% to 5.4%. And there's a lot of variance across different subregions. East Asia, for example, we are upgrading slightly from 7.4 to 7.5 this year because newly industrialized economies such as Korea and Hong Kong, China, and Taipei, China are benefiting from the strong recovery of global trade. Central Asia, we're also upgrading slightly from 3.4 to 3.6 because of the recovery of the global commodity markets. On the other hand, South Asia, as well as Southeast Asia and the Pacific consists of Fiji, Papua New Guinea, and other small countries. For these subregions, there are slight downgrades because of the impact of COVID-19 and new restrictions. But overall, as you can see, the impact of the COVID-19 on developing Asia's growth forecasts is quite limited. Finally, if you look at the bottom row on the right-hand side, you will see excluding NIEs, that is GDP growth forecast excluding newly industrialized economies. In other words, developing Asian countries which are not really developing countries, such as Korea, Hong Kong, China, Taipei, China, and Singapore. And of course, the numbers are higher because richer countries tend to grow more slowly.
Thank you, Dr. Park, for the informative macro insights. Yes, while economies are turning the corner, we have to recognize that the risk is still tilted to the downside. For audience questions, please use the Q&A chat box. We will be answering them after all the presenters and panelists have spoken. By the way, Dr. Park is here with us, but will be joining later during the panel discussion. Our second speaker is Dr. Taimur Baig, Managing Director and Chief Economist at DBS Bank. He heads global economics as well as macro strategy for interest rate, credit, and currency at DBS Group Research. Prior to DBS, he was a principal economist at the Economic Policy Group of the Monetary Authority of Singapore. Earlier, he was Managing Director and Chief Economist for Asia at Deutsche Bank. Dr. Baig holds a PhD in economics from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and he attended London School of Economics and Wabash College. Dr. Baig, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that, Eugene. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for having me here. It's a real pleasure, and I have to say it's been great listening to the others so far, and I wish Dr. Park a full recovery. You see, Dr. Park works for ADB, and therefore he's compelled to share with you some of his earlier estimates, which you probably were wondering, why is he showing you such outdated stuff? But then you saw he brought you up with the July updates. I'd like to add that there will be a couple of my charts which might look similar to his, and also that now that we're in late August and we've had another 2 months of full-blown COVID-related deterioration to the outlook in the region, even my colleagues in ADB, when they come up with their September report, will probably show you somewhat lower numbers, especially for the countries like Malaysia, Thailand, and Philippines, than the ones that you just saw on the screen. All right, so my objective here is to share with you some of the views that are similar to what our colleague from ADB said, and maybe look at it from the remedy angle as well. So I have 4 things to talk about. We will go through the loss of output. It was showed in one of the slides by Dr. Park earlier. I'll also show that and amplify that a little bit. I'll then talk about the debt burden in Asia relative to what's happening in the West. I will then focus on something that is very close to the hearts and minds of bankers, the private sector balance sheet, and what are the risks in the region around that. And then I'll end by talking about some of the remedies that are out there for us. So as I said earlier, that I will share certain slides that might look similar to what Dr. Park showed. So this is the level of real GDP of the world on the left-hand panel that you're seeing. And there are 2 trend lines here. So as you can see, even before we came into the COVID crisis, global growth was slowing. If you take the 2010 to 2019 trend, compare it with the last 4 years from 15 to 19, already the trend line was abating. And if you extrapolate that trend performance, you would already get a more subdued picture for the future. Then, of course, COVID came, and it didn't really matter whether you were looking at the trend of 2010 to 19 or 2015 to 19. things are much, much worse now. So that we have had a shock. Now, thanks to the tyranny of arithmetic, 2021 is marked by lots of nice looking positive growth numbers. They mean absolutely nothing, because the fact is just about everywhere in the world, with the exception perhaps of the US and China, everybody is significantly below trend output through this year and will remain so next year. And I'll show you some chart that suggests not a particularly bright picture for the medium term either. For emerging and developed Asia, the shock was not as deep as the global shock, but as far as the recovery is concerned, rather subdued. And we will probably go through 23, 24 remaining well below trend. Okay, so now think about countries like India, Indonesia, the countries that we sort of take for granted as what we call high yielding economies, high nominal GDP growth rate, high nominal interest rates, high stock market return, and so on. Even those countries which should bounce back once the COVID nightmare is over and report high single-digit growth numbers in 21, 22, and beyond, will still be struggling to make up for the lost ground. So this is the IMF's World Economic Outlook, which, by the way, is the rather optimistic one. So what you're seeing is a rose-colored view, not even the pessimistic view. And even this shows that by 2025, 26, as we're heading into the second half of this decade, both India and Indonesia's real GDP per capita would remain significantly below trend. And it's important to make sure that there is a recognition of the difference between the earlier chart, which is level of GDP, and this chart, which is level of GDP per capita. Because mind you, countries like India, Indonesia, Philippines, and so on have decent population growth rate as well. So it's not just a question of making up the level, but it has to be a question of making it up on a per capita basis. And that's where the challenge lies. These countries, in spite of COVID, will continue to grow population-wise. They would therefore demand high single-digit nominal and perhaps even real GDP growth if we are going to go back to the trend, which at this juncture looks rather unlikely. So the cost beyond GDP is debt. So the US, of course, is leading the world, adding more than 25% of GDP worth of debt over the last year and a half, and that probably will continue to go up through the course of 22-23. But let's put the Americans and the Europeans aside. They have significant exorbitant privilege with respect to being able to print money and get AAA ratings, which we in our part of the world do not have. But even here, debt burdens have risen substantially. I never used to worry about Indonesia's debt GDP ratio. Ever since the global financial crisis, Asian financial crisis in '97, Indonesia went on a deep deleveraging trend, and through the GFC and beyond, had exceptionally low debt GDP ratio. No more. Through the course of the last year, they've added about 25%, or rather 10% of GDP, which is a 25% jump onto their debt stock. And I fear that this will continue to go up again through 21, 22 as the dust settles and COVID-related expenditure continue to overwhelm, and underwhelming economic activity continue to drag down revenues. Then you have the likes of India, which for a very long time has been struggling to put debt under control. And it was sort of beginning to flatten out. But also India has been subject to some degree of forbearance and off-balance sheet treatment of its debt. IMF tries to capture all of that, and that's why we see this number, which is somewhat different from what the government of India would publish, but that does not include these liabilities and off-balance sheet items that the IMF includes. So India is going from about 74 to 87% of GDP or so through these 2 years of the pandemic, and you will see China not that far behind, heading towards 70% of GDP, and even countries like Thailand, Philippines, which tend to have very strong views on what is the threshold for their GDP ratio, are letting it all go and adding good 15% or so to their debt burden. So this is just the public sector that we're talking about, and therefore it's not even a full picture of the overall debt outlook for the region. I'm going to come back to that momentarily, but I just want to say one thing with respect to the private sector balance sheet, which is if you have high leverage, public sector, private sector, household, corporates, doesn't really matter, but there's a feedback loop between shocks, financial conditions, and overall leverage, which then loops back into financial conditions. So think about last year, big global economic shock. Understandably, we all try to ease financial conditions by lowering interest rates, injecting liquidity, exercising regulatory forbearance. What happens then? Well, people say, I can probably take on a little more leverage. because I need to make up for the business loss of activity. So let's take on a little more debt to keep myself alive. Hopefully things will be better next year and I'll be able to pay my debt back as revenues pick up and economic growth resumes. But if we are going to have these sort of weakness for multiple years, then the financial conditions easing would lead to excessive buildup in leverage, which then could lead to asset price bubbles, which come with its own set of risks, or could lead to unsustainable growth in certain sectors, which then can lead to some degree of reckoning when things start to normalize as policies support are withdrawn. And then you might have a feedback loop where these things then start deflating, and that creates a loop back into the financial conditions tightening, and the authorities then get into a very troublesome situation where A, they want to prevent excesses from taking place, B, they don't want to undermine the entire economic recovery. So that's the sort of dynamic and private balance sheet concerns that both authorities as well as banks would need to keep in mind in the coming years. It's a typical situation associated with large shocks and their aftermath, as we saw in the aftermath of the Asian financial crisis in the late 90s and the global financial crisis in the late 2000s. Okay, I said earlier that we will look at not just the public sector balance sheet, but also the full balance sheet here. So I've got private and public in this chart. And as you can see, when you think about US, Europe on a consolidated basis, they are about 260 to 70% of GDP. And particularly with respect to public sector, it's picked up a lot, which is the black solid line on this chart. But Asia is not that far behind. I mean, look at South Korea's leverage up over the last decade or so. Look at China, look at Malaysia. So we have quite a few countries which have had added substantial debt burden even before the pandemic-related considerations came in. As we start getting more data for 2021, both with respect to public sector, private sector leverage on households and corporates, I think we will see these bars go up even further. Nowhere do you see in the world deleveraging right now. There's not even a consideration for companies and households and governments. It's all about staying afloat through whatever forbearance and whatever easing that can be done. And the reckoning is years away if things are fine, or maybe a year away if indeed we see rates in the US start going up, and then we're going to have some serious issues in our part of the world. All right, enough about doom and gloom. Let's think about some remedies and sort of what can we as participants in the global banking system do. So first and foremost, this is not something that is only relevant for policymakers. The first bullet that I have is to recognize the forthcoming decline in Y star, R star, and U star. This is very central bank speak, which is, the Fed would say that, they conduct monetary policy through their estimate of neutral interest rates and potential GDP and neutral rate, non-accelerating rate of unemployment and so on. But as private sector participants, we should also consider that if indeed we're going to see sustained headwinds to growth going forward and structurally lower interest rates, should we sort of push aside the interest spread driven model and try to focus on a model of fee income? What I'm saying is clearly not news to anybody on this call. All banks recognize this issue. Depending on which part of the world you are, the risks are greater. But I think sitting here in Asia, we need to sort of keep this in mind, that just because none of our countries are at the zero bound or not at risk of negative interest rate doesn't mean that those risks are not around the corner. Think about a country like Thailand, not that far from the zero bound. Think about countries like Taiwan and Korea. What's happening in Japan easily happen there. And how the banks deal with that, we have to see the experience of the European banks and the Japanese banks to make sure that we don't go down that road to protect our profitability and our performance. Second is this issue of the limitation of conventional fiscal and monetary policy. Again, Europeans, Americans, the Japanese are very different. Their gross asset positions, their public sector balance sheet, they're standing in the global markets at a fundamentally different level. And therefore, we cannot look at their debt GDP ratios and say that if they can live with such high ratios, we can. We cannot. The market simply will not allow Asian emerging market economies or even the newly industrialized economies of Asia to have exceptionally high debt burden. They would then have to sort of reach into their own pockets to sustain themselves. So the limitation of fiscal and monetary policy with respect to zero bound, quantitative easing, monetization of debt, those things I hope will not be characteristics that are being observed in the West being mimicked in our part of the world, because that would be bad news. it is very important for financial institutions in the private sector, as well as those in the public sector in Asia, to not give up on globalization. We need to re-energize multilateralism. I was very happy as 2022 ended, RCEP got signed, which I think has tremendous potential in the region for cooperation within the private and public sectors and reaching out activities across borders. I was also pleased to see that CPTPP is getting re-energized. The US is not as close-minded with respect to trade as it was under the Trump administration, although so far US overtures vis-a-vis China have been sort of non-existent on the trade front. But within ASEAN, things could be getting better very soon, and we might actually be somewhat of a beneficiary of the great power rivalry. And at the narrower level, beyond the big sort of trade agreements, I think regional pacts, supply chain related regional issues, regional footprint are, I think, very, very important for banks, whether they want to build APIs on their remittance platform or they want to help corporations with trade credit. I think regionalism is the byword in my view as far as banks' outlook is concerned. And then the last two issues are more, again, the public sector related. One is that let's just get ready. One of the reckoning of this crisis would be higher taxes. Depending on which country you're living in right now in this call, chances are property taxes, wealth taxes, and so on will have to go up to pay for that exceptionally sharp jump in debt GDP ratio that we have experienced over the last 18 months and will continue to do so going into 2022. And finally, I think that banks have a tremendous role to play here, which is the use of technology to enhance public sector transfers and spending on growth critical areas. I hope to come back to this issue during the Q&A session, but for the time being, I'm just going to stop and let the successive speakers take over. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Baig. Good news, bad news, good recommendations, and I'm sure questions later. Our next speaker is Dr. Le Xia, Chief Economist for Asia at BBVA Research Department. He also serves as a research fellow in International Monetary Institute at Renmin University of China. Prior to joining BBVA research team, Dr. Xia worked for the Treasury Department of Bank of China, Hong Kong. He obtained his PhD from the University of Hong Kong and a master's degree from Renmin University of China. Dr. Xia, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, so I'm very glad to be back to attend this virtual event of ABA. So I think previously Dr. Park and Dr. Baig have already done very good presentation of the short-term economic outlook of the region. So now I'm sharing my screen. I hope you can see my screen clearly. I'm going to focus on one interesting topic. Okay, or maybe this topic is not that present. Okay, there's a issue between China and the US relation and how this one is going to affect the region. So I have a very catchy title, Between a Rock and a Hard Place. So let me show you the first slide. Here we show how these Asian economies are positions between China and the US. You need to read this table by line. I mean, if we start with the first one, Hong Kong, here I show that Hong Kong export to China account for 55% of its total export, and its import from China account for 45% of its total imports. Okay, and then in the bracket I show the rank in terms of this market share. Apparently, China is the #1 export destination for Hong Kong, and at the same time, China is also the #1 import source of the Hong Kong. Okay, by the similar line, the US is the second largest export destination for Hong Kong. Here I didn't show the imports because it's very difficult to calculate the Hong Kong's imports from US. Okay, but if you look at this table, we can see that all these Asian countries, they are very reliant on China and the US, because if you look at the numbers in brackets, China either the #1 or the #2 of these countries' exports or imports. But at the same time, the US, they are number 2 or number 3 of this country's export or import source. So put together, we know how important this China and the US to these Asian economies. But unfortunately, now it seems these are too important, I like to say. Most of the important trade partners of these countries and the regions, they are trying to fight with each other. And then, unfortunately, that will affect these countries as well. Most of the time, I think that the impact will be negative. And then let's move to the second slide. Here, I show the Chinese outward FDI to different regions globally. Okay, here I show the figure of the 2019 and the figure of the 2020. We all know that because of this pandemic last year, this Chinese or global outward FDI has been seriously affected. But one interesting fact here shows that in Asia, in 1919, the figure is $31.3 billion US dollar. That's Chinese investment in all these Asian countries. But in 2020, even with the impact of the pandemic, we have a 33.9 billion US dollar investment from China in the region. So that shows that not only for trade, also in terms of this direct investment, the Chinese role in the region has been increasing as we viewed over the past several years. And this kind of the trend even strengthened during this pandemic time. I do expect that this figure will be much higher this year than last year. So that shows the impact of the China in the region has been increasing in terms of this outward investment. Okay, and we talk about this trade, we talk about this direct investment. Here we talk about financial market. I think I can skip this slide full of these words, directly go to this one of the chart. Here we have done some research. We showed, it looks like this, there's a correlation between different asset classes between China, US, and Asia. In fact, that's not solo the correlation, because here, if you look at the right side, left side, we show that's the shock. That shows the causality, as we say. That shows that we can take the first line as example. Here shows the US bond shock. We can see that sometimes this shock happened in US bond market. Then this kind of shock will have an impact on different asset market. For example, the first one, US bond market, that's 1%, that's 1-to-1, of course. And then they have very strong impact on US stock market. And they also have some impact on China bond market, China stock market, RMB and the US dollar, that's a foreign exchange market. And also that could affect this Asian bond, Asian stock, Asian currency. I highlighted this interesting one. Of course, we know that the US bond market shock is a very important shock for Asian bond. We highlight that there. But as also the US stock shock, and we can see sometimes that the US foreign exchange, the RMB US dollar foreign exchange rate, they also affect this Asian currency market as well. But at the same time, I like to highlight that now the Chinese stock market shock also have very significant impact on Asian stock market. So this shows that, as I like to say, with this integration of the Chinese market into Asia, into the world, after this, they joined this WTO, and this kind of the impact not only show on trade, not only showed on this direct investment, it also shows on the financial market. And this impact and this result are a couple of years ago, but I believe that nowadays this kind of the impact will be more and more significant. That means this trade, direct investment, and all this financial market, they tend to affect with each other. The US one, the Chinese one, they could all have a very significant impact on our Asian market. Okay, and now here on this slide, we also show some, we can see the significant market that could show very pronounced the impact from Chinese shock. For example, on the left side, we show Hong Kong, Singapore, and Indonesia. They're most subject to the shocks from their stock market, most subject to Chinese stock market. On the right side, we show this Australia, this Indonesia, Malaysia, and also New Zealand. Their exchange rate, they are most subject to the exchange rate impact of RMB and US dollar. Put it together, as I said, all this trade and direct investment and also financial market tend to affect with each other, okay? Then if China and the US, this kind of the tension continue to escalate as we are seeing now, so I'm afraid that not only for this geopolitical side, also on the economic side, all these Asian countries, enterprises, the governments, the enterprises, the financial sector, they need to work a fine line between this kind of the tension. So then what's the next? I think I skip this one. So let's make some forecast for the Sino-US relation. So now the keywords of the Biden administration is compete, confront, cooperate. I like to say it's a very, sounds very good because from US perspective, they want to compete where they want to compete with US, with China. They want to confront with China where they want to make this confrontation. They want to cooperate with China. In the field, they want to cooperate with China, for example, in this climate change things. But unfortunately, I think it's not that practical for China fully accept this kind of strategy because in many fields, if you want to compete with China, okay, but if you want to cooperate with China, the China will use this one to negotiate, okay, or they try to fight back to use this kind of the stakes they have. So that means in future, we do expect a lot of turbulence between between China and the US. I think that this one could have very significant impact, not only on China, on US, globally, especially in Asia, because I have shown that in the previous slides, that the impact of the Chinese economy on the region is huge. Also, we know that the US, they want to use some new strategy against China. They want to emphasize the value difference, and they try to find more allies globally with a similar value. For example, the EU, Japan, and even some other countries in the region to be against China. But China, they also make their own response to this kind of the strategy. For example, I think it's very interesting to see that now they kind of make some change. So previously, they want to negotiate with China to reach some deal. As we see 2 years ago, in fact, they reached this kind of the trade war truce, okay, between China and the US. But now it seems that China become more assertive. So they try to use this strategy of, I described selective tit for tat, okay? But for good reason, I think that they also try to separate the issue of this economic issue from this politics issue. That's why, although we see this pandemic continue to ravage in the world, but the US and the Chinese trade relation has been very good. Either the US export to China has been increased substantially, the Chinese export to US and to other countries also increased substantially. So that's a good sign. But still, I think that there's an interesting point. I think that could have some implications for Asian countries. That's the Chinese attitude towards the potential US allies. Okay, I like to say during the Trump administration, I think China, they're trying to isolate the US because Trump is trying to fight with everyone. That's why China, they try to use some economic benefit to attract support from other countries, from Europe, from Japan. So that's why here I described that's a strategy is anyone but the US. I remember during that time, China tried to open its domestic financial market. And then they try to offer very good treatment to the countries they don't want to cooperate with US against China. So that's very interesting. But now the US strategy against China changed. So they try to find more alliance. They try to side with the EU, with Japan, with other countries to be against China. So now we also feel that China also changed their way to deal with the current situation. Here I use the word cut tail to feed that dog. The reason is now China try to punish the countries they want to, or they directly cooperate with US to be against China. I think that's a very important change for Chinese policy. One example is the recent Australia. And the interesting is China have some kind of economic war against Australia on the trade side. But at the same time, China is trying to shift a part of these export orders like wine, like other agricultural products. Before they import from Australia, but now they ship these kind of orders to the US. That's a very interesting development. So by this way, I think the China tried, and that's another strategy. They try to separate the US with their alliance. They try to show the US alliance that you cannot get any benefit by siding with the US against us. The only way you can do that one, you do the business with us directly. So anyway, let me conclude. This kind of the extreme competition between China and the US could last as long as maybe 15 years from now on. So that means this kind of tension will have significant impact on the business communities in the region. Of course, there's some potential change could happen, including this leadership change in China or US, the change of relative power in the economy of military capacity, also in the face of the common threat. If US, they find that this climate change is a much bigger threat, or we are going to have other big common threat, maybe the US, they will try to negotiate with China to improve their relations. Then which side we're going to win in this situation, in this competition? It depends which one can better handle their domestic affairs. Frankly, I think both China and the US, they have a very serious challenge domestically. Part of the reason why they try to escalate their tension is because they cannot easily, or they cannot solve their own problem in a very short time. So they have to use this one to divert people's attention. Okay, so that's why they try to be tough against with each other. But in the long run, who's going to win? Or they are going to find a better solution to cooperate again. Anyway, they need to handle their domestic affairs very well. Okay, so let me stop here to give the time back to our host. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sia. This Sino-US tension is going to be a continuing concern for the region. Now let's go to the panelists. Our first panelist is Shri Ashwini Kumar Tiwari, Managing Director of State Bank of India, handling the portfolio of international banking, information technology, and associates and subsidiaries of the bank, including major non-bank businesses like credit cards, asset management, life and general insurance, capital markets, and custodial services. He is an electrical engineer by degree, a certified associate of the Indian Institute of Bankers, and a sentimental gentleman who loves Bollywood melodies. Mr. Tiwari, floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Acevedo. I hope I'm audible. Having seen the technical challenges in the first virtual ABA conference. Thank you to ABA organizers for inviting me here. I have fond memories of ABA 2015 at Taipei and 2016 at Hanoi, where I was present in person. And as we can all see, being in person is definitely the better idea, despite all the hybrid models, which we will talk about. So at the cost of pandemic, I mean, what I would do in my opening remarks is to talk about the situation, how it has happened in India. What are the steps the Indian government, the regulators, and the banks have taken together to overcome the pandemic, and what are kind of changes we are witnessing in India. Uh, uh, so at the cost of repetition, let me say this is a once in a century phenomena. The last global pandemic, I mean, there have been multiple diseases we call pandemic, but the last global pandemic was the Spanish flu of 1917-18, just on the back of World War I. And this, which has estimated to have killed almost 50 million plus people. Now that's a very, very large number compared to whatever number we are talking about, some 2-3 million perhaps. And the important thing is that that event was so traumatic. I mean, a lot of younger people died. This pandemic, we have seen a lot of seniors die, and those with comorbidities die. That pandemic had a lot of younger people in the 20s, 30s. They died in big numbers. It was so traumatic that in India, which is supposed to have lost about 5 million people, there is no mention of it in either history or literature. You see fragments of it in indirect historical references, in some poetry of the time, etc. So which means this trauma, everybody wanted to forget it as soon as it came. And you remember the roaring 20s in the US just after this. So therefore, the difference this time is the advances in science and technology, and the vaccine development in less than a year of the pandemic having hit us is just amazing. I mean, we have to really stop and think about this kind of a scientific development. The best known vaccine was developed in about 10 years time. That was the fastest known before this. So therefore, this is a really fantastic scientific achievement. However, the initial way to handle the lockdown, handle the pandemic was lockdowns, travel bans, and some of which still continue, especially the travel bans and the travel restrictions. And they had an economic shock, as everybody well knows. The businesses, especially in the hospitality, the travel, the entertainment, all of them suffered, and they're still suffering. India was no exception, and we had a very, very strict lockdown in the year starting from March of 2020. For almost 3 months, we were mostly fully locked down, and as a result, our Q1 GDP number was minus 24% over the previous quarter. So the opening up started after that, and gradually the economy picked up, and by the end of the year, we had come into positive territory. However, as shown earlier in graphs by the other speakers, we ended the year at about minus 8% GDP, so which is a big number. And the quarter two, I mean, this current year, we had started out well, but suddenly the second wave hit us, and this actually took away some of the benefits which we had gathered. And now the second wave has receded, and we hope that with the vaccination step up, we will not have a third wave as strong. We will surely have a third wave, as a lot of people have predicted, but hopefully it will not be as strong as the second wave was. And therefore, the recovery could be much sharper, and as has been projected by various economists, including the leading economic indicators of business activity index by Nomura, by our bank itself, the purchasing manager index. All of these factors tell us that the recovery has picked up pace, and it's going to be very strong. State Bank of India is the leading bank of India, as most of you will know. It's a bank with $659 billion in assets and a global ranking of 56 as per the Banker magazine. And it is a mirror to the Indian economy. It reflects the Indian economy, and so therefore, whatever our experience is, this would rather be the experience of the banking industry and the finance in Indian economy. So our experience in just a couple of lines is the non-performing assets are under control. We were thinking that this would spike up significantly, and there are reasons for why that is. The loan growth has been muted. Companies have been deleveraging, not investing. Deposit growth was very high last year, and there have been some outflows seen in districts where their high COVID load was there. And there are some steps which the government, the regulator took, which actually mitigated and led to this situation. For example, there was a provision of free food grains for people below poverty line. In India, there are still a lot of people who depend on the government handouts like this. And more than 50% of the population was potentially covered. Not all of them used it, of course. The RBI, or the Reserve Bank of India, which is the regulator, they brought in a 6-month loan moratorium, which was given to all industries and businesses. And they need not have asked for it. Unless somebody refused to take it, it was available. Similarly, MSMEs, which is the lifeline of most economies, were given emergency credit line guarantee scheme, which is the central government guaranteed the enhancement in limits to these MSMEs to the banks. So the banks did not feel any hesitation in lending to already stressed units. And up to $7 million approximately was covered at a very concessional rate of interest. And this was for a period of almost 4 years. So this was utilized with a lot of MSMEs, and almost $3 trillion rupees of line was made available to MSMEs and to the banks to do it. The regulator also came out with the long-term funding, long-term refinancing operations called TLTRO, in which selected sectors like non-banks, hotels, these were all given funding by banks investing in their instruments like CDs or CPs or NCDs, so that they get the liquidity which they wanted. So all these measures of emergency credit line, the deferment, the moratorium, the liquidity support, all of this helped the business and thereby helped the banks in turn, because the bank's performance and the bank's NPLs was not significantly impacted. In fact, the vaccination is one area where the bank has really taken it upon itself to vaccinate all its employees, their families, the vendors which work with us. And very quickly, some of the trends we have seen as a result of all this is a quick shift to work from home. None of the Indian banks were actually had capability to work from home. So they all developed this capability and they all successfully did this. And now we are back to a hybrid model, but with heightened cybersecurity risks. There was a sharp acceleration digitization trends with the United Payment Interface, or UPI as it is called, really scaling up. And the RBI digital index actually shot up to 270 from 207, just about 2 years. So about 20% of the transactions today are digital, which is a very, very big scale up. We had a lot of funds coming into fintech sector. And the final thing is the pandemic focused attention on health infrastructure, health insurance, the penetration of which is very low in India. So overall, I would say the pandemic has been a wake-up call for us. And the bigger emergency which is coming up slowly, is the climate change. And we better prepare for it. This has been a trailer for us. And though we are coming out of it successfully, hopefully, the climate change is a much bigger problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Tiwari. Thank you for sharing the story of India and SBI. Our next speaker is Dr. Paul Lei, chairman of both Taiwan Cooperative Financial Holding Company and its subsidiary Taiwan Cooperative Bank.
Hi. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, please, sir.
Okay. It's my honor to join today's panel discussion. First, I would like to respond to the speeches given by our distinguished speakers. As shown in Dr. Park's report, the GDP growth of Taiwan is relatively unscathed by the pandemic than most of other countries. Our GDP growth rate was actually 3.1% in 2020 and are expected to be 5.9% and 3.7% respectively in 2021 and 2022. The main driving force of Taiwan's economic growth is exports. The global chip market shows a severe imbalance between supply and demand due to the pandemic. As a result, Taiwan's semiconductor supply chain, led by TSMC, has grown substantially, and Taiwan's export have continued to flourish. Dr. Shah indicates that many Asian economies show a great trade dependence on China and the US. Indeed, China and the US for a long time remain to be Taiwan's #1 and #3 exporting markets as well as importing suppliers. Dr. Shah also mentioned the linkage between among Asian stock markets, but our study shows that Taiwan stock index and the US Dow Jones index actually were highly and positive correlated. The correlation coefficient between two indices was 0.88 in 2020. According to Dr. Bay's report, the ratios of public debt to GDP in most countries have shown a significant upward trend during the pandemic. However, this ratio in Taiwan was not only lower than most countries, but showed relatively stable during the pandemic. The ratios in Taiwan were 32.7, 33.7, and 32.5%, respectively, from 2019 to 2021. Then I would like to share with you what we have learned from the challenges and disruptions of the changing economic ecosystem. First, the major changes to the world brought about by the pandemic and extreme weather include the rapid development of the zero-contact economy. the growing demand for digital technology and remote operation capability and new work models, such as online meetings and work from home, we can foresee that these major changes will become our new normal lifestyle. My opinion is that we should accordingly improve our management of emerging risk and strengthen capital management capability to cope with such impacts in an effective way. Meanwhile, we cannot ignore that digital finance has played an increasingly important role. Risk management in banks should not focus solely on traditional risk, such as credit risk, liquidity risk, etc., but should also come up with a complete set of evaluation mechanisms and countermeasures against emerging risk arose in recent years. During the pandemic period, global governments have not only adopted loose fiscal and monetary policy, but have launched interim, relaxed measures for the capital requirements for banks. However, in my opinion, these flexible approaches are contingent plans in response to the pandemic crisis. In the long run, strengthening capital management in accordance with Basel III is still a common trend in international banking industry. Digital transformation is now a world trend that we all have to face it. We need to enhance our digital business maturity and digital service value as soon as possible. TCB utilized fintech to reform business process into digital services, such as online personal loans, online account opening, digital accounts, video teller machine, e-pay, AI customer services, and others. The intensified impact of the pandemic and nature environment changes has accentuated the importance of global sustainable development, and the ESG issues have attracted more international attention. The financial industry should play a critical role in guiding financial resources in the overall economy and be a key driving force behind the sustainable development of enterprises and industry. That's basically what we have learned from the recent experiences. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lei. Thank you for bringing together the economic discussion with the experience of your bank, which somebody like you with a PhD in economics and a banker can put together. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our next speaker will be coming in with an interesting, unique point of view. Dr. Katie Dinin is an assistant lecturer in the Department of Philosophy at University College Cork and a senior associate at the Misen Group. She lectures and publishes in the area of value theory. Her research work focuses on facilitating the acquisition of values through education. Dr. Dinin holds a PhD and MSc in government from the London School of Economics and an MA in philosophy from University College Cork in Ireland. Dr. Dinin, please.
Well, firstly, thank you for having me. It's quite a change from the usual sort of conference I partake in. So thank you very much. And it's so interesting to hear the thoughts of the other speakers. I especially liked the last speaker, Dr. Lei, talking about the role of the financial sector in this current climate, in supporting individuals within this current climate. And actually, I'm going to be talking about some fairly abstract ideas for the next 5 or so minutes. I'm going to be talking about trust and culture, which might seem quite different from what we've talked about this morning. But in fact, to me, they are quite interlinked. So if you allow me to talk a little bit about my professional history in the sort of research I like to do, and this might kind of be a nice segue into exploring this link between these abstract ideas of trust and culture and the more practical ideas of what banking, especially banking in Asia, might look like in the next years. So I've always been interested in value theory, right? How we acquire values as human beings and what these values are. And for a large part of my academic history, I was interested in political values, how we are obligated politically to help more vulnerable people in our communities and actually outside our communities. So my PhD looked at cosmopolitanism in political theory, which is the idea that we might be very far away from vulnerable others. They mightn't be in our sector of justice within a national state, but we still have political obligations to these others. So it was probably quite surprising to my family and friends when, after my PhD, I decided to leave academia and join banking. I became an equity analyst at Goldman Sachs. And even more surprising, perhaps, when focusing on banks, I went to a communications company called Brunswick Group to look at how to communicate about what banks are doing. But for me, actually, these two ideas were very linked. I believe, actually, that a healthy banking sector is so important for the communities within that state, right? So I believe that banks have a very important role in emancipating the vulnerable within their communities. It is, after all, banks which give mortgages where people can have a roof over their head. It is banks which support small businesses within communities. And a thriving banking sector is so important for a thriving community. So when I returned to academia, I got a call about 2 years ago from my head of department who asked me if I wanted to be a part of a special project. Now, he is the head of department at the philosophy department, but he's also a very eminent behavioral economist. We all love our interdisciplinary research at UCC. And he told me that the project was to define and measure culture within banks. And of course, I jumped at this. I thought this was an amazing idea. So my work at Mizzen is to look at culture. And within the first couple of weeks at Mizzen, I started to advise them that actually the reason culture was important within banks had to do with trust. So trust and culture became very popular after the 2007 and 2008 crisis, right? Regulators started talking about trust. Communities started talking about a lack of trust. The Edelman Barometer tells us that, at least in the US and in Europe, there is a crisis of trust coming from the 2007 crisis and still relevant today. Apparently, people don't trust their banks, and they still use them, mind, and they don't keep their money under their mattress, but they don't trust their banks. So one of the first things I did at Mizzen was to follow the philosophy of someone called Baroness Honora O'Neill, who's a very eminent philosopher, but also works a lot with the British Standards Board here and also the New York Fed, to say that actually it's trust. Trust isn't important. What's important is trustworthiness. If you increase the trust of regulators and customers of banks without actually doing something about the trustworthiness of the banks themselves, then you've created a bigger problem, right? And when it comes to understanding whether banks are trustworthy, the best way of doing that is understanding what the culture looks like for the employees of the banks. Banks are their people. That's all they are. They invest massive amounts of money in their people. That is their resource. So how do you measure that? Well, the first thing you do is you say, well, what is culture? And culture is the beliefs and values latent within the organization that support those employees to behave in a certain way. It might support misconduct, right? It might be difficult for employees to actually do the right thing because of the beliefs and values within that organization, or it might support proper conduct. So that's what you're trying to measure. And you measure it by looking at what the employees are telling you, what they perceive about their culture. If you combine that, if you ask the questions in the right way, and there's a lot of researchers here on this board, so you know how important that is, right? To get the items within your diagnostic and to actually ask the questions that will give you not what you want to hear, but the truth of what those employees actually perceive. And you combine that with really up-to-date behavioral economics and the kind of statistical models that these economics people can come up with. That is not my sector. I have to say I'm not a statistician. Then you can come up with something very important and very insightful to give back to banks, right? So how is that important in the current climate? Well, trust isn't just important within banks, right? Really, markets are based on trust. It's John Maynard Keynes said that investing is just really successfully anticipating the anticipations of others, right? And that's based on trust. It's based on the idea that you can anticipate what the market is going to do. You can make rational predictions about how you ought to invest. If there is a crisis, like the 2007 or 2008 crisis, then that sort of trust that you can do that rationally might start to break down. We are looking at a massive crisis here now again, obviously. And we are looking at perhaps the breakdown of that trust from investors, and we can see the ramifications of that. When the dust cleared in the 2007 and 2008 crisis, what was left, if we are to believe these trust barometers, was an untrustworthy banking sector, a sector that people believed were evil. I got that a lot when I joined Goldman Sachs. Why are you going from being one of the good guys to one of the bad guys, right? When the dust clears after this crisis, we should be careful that we're not left with that sort of image again. And one way we can do that, right, is to try and understand what is happening within the individual banks and to try and understand the sort of climate and culture that banking employees are being faced with. As these shocks happen at the macro level, they will put pressure all the way down the feeding chain to the individual banker. Once again, when the dust clears from this, that pressure will become evidenced and will make itself felt at the trustworthy level of the whole sector. So if that is the one thing I can leave the people here watching me today, is to know your culture and to make sure that within the individual banks, you are creating cultures of trustworthiness for your employees, and that it's easy for them to do the right thing.
Thank you, Dr. Dinin. We will be good boys and girls, focusing on culture. Now we have very little time left for questions. Now, why don't we go straight? Let me start with Dr. Baig. You recommended re-energize multilateralism and regional pacts. How can bankers, especially in the Asian Bankers Association, what can we do to encourage that kind of regional cooperation?
I'll share with you a startling piece of statistic. I was talking to Dr. Joon yesterday. Dr. Joon used to be the chief economist of PBOC. Now he sort of heads climate-related work for China. He represents China in the G20 on climate change issues. So he said that they're about to release a report, the Chongqing Declaration, I think it's coming out in a week or two, where they're going to significantly revise up their expenditure needs for the net zero goal that China is setting for 2060. And the number that he shared with me was 500 trillion RMB over the next 40 years, which is such a big number that I couldn't even process it for a second. So it's basically $75 trillion, which is about 10% of GDP. Every year, China wants to allocate toward climate change between now and 2060. Now, this is not money that is in the pocket of the government of China. This is money that has to be raised. Bond issuances, bank loans, syndicated projects, where you make the hybrid instruments to finance it. And all of these things have to go through green labeling and ratings and due diligence and finding investors to take part in this thing, not just in China, but cross-border. So for banks, in terms of regionalism, I mean, every speaker today has sooner or later talked a little bit about issues related to climate change, but I think climate finance or green finance is going to be probably the only really fast growing aspect of finance in the rest of our professional lives. Everything else, it's going to be really hard slog, the kind of competition that is coming from non-bank financial institutions. But banks have an incredibly important role to play with the governments around the world, particularly in Asia, as these very large climate-related finance needs are going to be met through fundraising and issuances. So I think that's one area where banks can start forming consortiums, because again, when you're talking about these numbers, they're so large, very few banks are large enough to swallow it on their own. They would have to be part of syndicates, which then work side by side with the governments. So government of Singapore has a $100 billion plan to deal with rising sea levels. Government of China is coming up with numbers that we can't even fathom. It's so large. And in between, there'll be many other countries in Asia which will also be setting aside very substantial resources. And so that's my sort of, one overarching answer, that getting very serious and very involved in climate change initiatives, I think, could give the banks a major shot in the arm when they're at this point struggling with low interest rates and other headwinds.
Thank you, Dr. Beg. I agree with you. That's in fact, Mr. Tewari mentioned that earlier as well. Now, let us go to Dr. Sia. That tension is interesting. But we've seen that American bankers are highly engaged with Asian bankers. We don't see the same kind of engagement between Chinese bankers and everybody else in the region. Something has to change. What do you expect that the Chinese bankers might be doing over the next 5 to 10 years to make that change?
Definitely, I think I agree with you that if you look at the Chinese banking sector, their communication or their interaction with other Asian bankers are not that frequent. I think in future, definitely they need to do more. And it depends at what pace the Chinese authorities, they want to liberalize their domestic financial sector. Also, I think it depends at what pace China can internationalize its own currency, because we all know this internationalization of RMB is a very hot topic globally. I think that if we talk about this RMB internationalization, it will prompt all these Chinese financial institutions to go abroad, to Europe, to US. But now I think more difficult for them to go there. So I think that's why they are going to go to other Asian countries. I think that will be the next trend. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent idea related to what Dr. Baig said. Every single country is going to spend a lot on climate change, and maybe that's where we can connect. Now, let me go to a different issue which was raised by Dr. Park, and it has something to do with demographics, a very Asian issue. In some countries, we have an aging population, but in more countries, we have young populations. This poses different risks and opportunities for specific countries, but for the region as a whole, what risks and opportunities does this provide us, Dr. Park?
Thank you for the question. Of course, there's a lot of differences and heterogeneity across Asian countries. One of the most striking structural heterogeneities, of course, demographics, with some Asian countries, particularly richer ones, such as Japan and Korea and Singapore, for example, where the population aging is a here and now crisis, to countries with still relatively younger populations, right? Such as Philippines, Indonesia, and India. Of course, in the first instance, there is opportunities in terms of younger workers from the younger countries migrating to these richer, older countries. But of course, there are some political challenges to that. But there's also investment opportunities. In other words, older, richer countries investing in younger, more dynamic countries, at least more demographically dynamic countries. But finally, in terms of leveraging Asia's immense structural heterogeneity, I would like to emphasize this regional value chain, because we will be moving more away from globalization toward regionalization. And the biggest driving factor is now that not only China, but ASEAN and increasingly India and even these countries, they are rich enough to be consumers of the final product. So we will while at the same time we see a weakening of the global value chain, we will see a stronger strengthening of the regional value chain, and that will really leverage Asia's structural heterogeneity in terms of technological level, income level, and so forth.
Thank you, Dr. Park. I think what's been happening just now, is that you are writing for us the agenda of the Asian Bankers Association going forward. Those are fantastic points. Now, let us go to the panelists. The first question is, if I can address it to Mr. Tiwari first. Even as customers have begun to embrace digital banking, trust is being elevated as an issue among customers because of the heightened cybersecurity risks that you mentioned. Phishing is now quite common. As we try to convince our customers to migrate to our digital channels, how do we give them a better sense of security? I think it's been a regional issue. Mr. Tiwari?
Thank you for that question. This is actually a global issue, not only a regional issue.
Yes.
As we have seen a sudden increase in digitalization across the world. I mean, in India, if I talk about that example, we have had elderly populations, elderly people, pensioners who have never gone digital. They are forced to go digital because the bank's branches were closed or not available easily. They don't want to go to the ATM because they don't want to catch the virus. So a lot of this has happened. Now, what has happened as a result is a lot of social engineering frauds, which means people calling up as if from a bank, like you said, phishing, and trying to get the details. And we have second factor for a long time now, but people have shared OTPs, people have shared the credentials, they have downloaded apps, all kinds of things have happened. So therefore, there is this cybersecurity risk which has come in, and it is leading to a loss of, let's say, a partial loss of trust, because the customer is not sure if the bank is calling or a fraudster is calling and what is going on. So therefore, to me, the basics are important. Basics include multiple things. The biggest is, of course, the awareness campaigns, that we need to have multiple rounds of awareness campaigns, digital, physical, in vernacular languages, different languages, so that the customer understands. We can call in people when they visit the branch, explain to them that nobody calls to ask your OTP or password, etc. Then the other thing is that we need to have insurance funds, cyber insurance funds for this thing specifically. I had done this in my previous company, at a card company which I headed. So we said that, okay, let us look at all the losses caused by this, how much that number is. And we found that number is not so significant. So we said, okay, up to a lower level, if we cover all those losses, this is about 90% of all losses. And we covered that. So that led to a lot of trust that, okay, you made a mistake, but we are covering you for that loss, but don't do it again. Otherwise, we will not fund you again. So that is one thing. This is a slightly out of the box area, but it worked in my case. And similarly, the third thing is that the banks themselves have to do a lot of upgradation. So for example, in our bank, we have now done SIM binding, because the phone itself, device registration itself was not proving enough. People were still able to download apps. We have had rogue apps. If they are there on the phone, our application does not work. We are blocking Tor IPs from where fraudsters might be approaching and doing attacks. We have done a lot of red team hacking. So with all of this, which of course we can't tell customers because they would not understand. What we tell them is, we will not call you. We will not ask your password. No, nobody will ever call you. And don't share anything with the bank, supposed bank. So I think a combination of all this is working. It's a journey. It is no easy answer.
Thank you. I especially like that idea of the insurance fund, thinking outside the box, because it is going to be happening anyway, right? Thank you. Let's now go to Dr. Lei. Dr. Lei, somewhat related to this, but more for your employees. You've gone through digitization, the digital transformation exercise, and I'm sure you know that it is more about people and cultural transformation. What has been your experience in persuading employees to depart from the old ways and have faith in the company's digital transformation plans? Dr. Lei? You're on mute, sir.
Okay. We let our employee, can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. We let our employees understand that the digital transformation is a world trend, that we all have to face it. And then we constantly train and educate them to improve their digital capability. And then we foster the innovation DNA in our organization, because we establish a cross-department Banks 3.0 team and set up core lab. It's kind of innovation laboratory to inspire our young talents to come up with good ideas or possible innovative fintech applications. And by now, actually, we already obtained more than 180 fintech patents and has been listed within the top 100 institutional patent applicants in Taiwan. It's not easy because normally the patent applicants are technology companies or the university research institutions. But as a financial institution, it's our honor to receive this kind of award. Yeah. So actually, we keep trying to, and also we since 2018 we started to hold a core inspiring camp, which we brainstorm all the senior managers and the young talents, young employees together to put forth innovative ideas about all kinds of like business development, the system platform upgrades, and operating procedures optimization, or even the corporate image enhancement, all kinds of ideas. Everybody can, through the brainstorming, can come up with it. And by now we already have 160 proposals hanging, and we actually 80% of them we already put into force. So that's kind, we train our employee and to let them know that they need to improve their digital capability to cope with the trend. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Lei. It's impressive that you are putting your seniors together with the youngest employees. And if it's working, I'm sure they feel like they are part of the strategy. That's a huge thing. Thank you. Now, we don't have much time. So for our last question, for Dr. Dinin, if I may ask you about hybrid work. Hybrid work, I think, has a major trust and cultural issue. I think many of us, I'm sure Dr. Lei and Mr. Tiwari would also have the same issue, right? It has become quite controversial. In some places, in the US, for example, the CEOs would say, hey, you can go to the restaurant, you can go to the beach, surely you can come to the office. But is there a better way of managing this? Is there a better way of managing hybrid work? This is going to be part, I think, as the bankers say here, this is going to be a part of our experience moving forward. What are your thoughts on this, Dr. Dinin?
It's a very interesting question. So I think that by looking at the trends, you can see that companies have responded in two ways. Some have been over the top with trying to almost spy on their employees to make sure they're working. And other companies have had a more trusting attitude, looking at productivity levels rather than hours worked and whether someone is sitting in front of a computer. One of the things I think that's very interesting from your question is that there are examples actually of companies that have been working like this before the pandemic, right? We worked with a bank, a digital bank in the US, who are completely online, and all of their workforce is online. And the one thing we saw from them actually is that because the culture was orientated towards trusting the way these employees work because it had been built up over time, actually they had a very mature attitude to this. And the employees had a real appreciation of the autonomy that was granted to them on this. And that showed up, we were particularly looking at compliance culture, right? So how employees reacted to compliance related issues and what were their perspectives on that. And that showed up in that particular sector, right? That the employees were very grateful for the autonomy they were given around these compliance related issues. And then we had this kind of virtuous circle happening within this company, right? And because the management wanted to know what was happening at the employee level, particularly when it came to compliance, and because they were willing to grant them this autonomy over compliance, and listen to their voices, you had this idea that the employees were actually gaining more and more autonomy, seeing the priority of compliance, right? But realizing that compliance was not something that they just needed to tick the box on, and that it was up to them to know when something was a compliance sensitive decision, right? That they had this autonomy. So I guess my answer would be that you can see companies where it really, really works. Those companies might be companies where it's actually in the culture of the DNA to begin with, right? Those companies where it's not within the culture, within the DNA, they're going to have a real problem granting their employees this trust. And if you're going to be distrusting your employees to do this, then you're going to be creating an obstacle at the very beginning, right? So as we move towards this hybrid kind of a work way, and where we see employees actually really do appreciate this way of working, then I think it behoves the company to look at their culture. Are they communicating to their employees that they are trusted in the way that's important, you know? And because if they're not, then they're going to be creating a vicious circle where the employees are distrusted, where they feel that they need to just tick the box of compliance, where they don't have the autonomy to make these decisions. And then you will have situations where employees are making mistakes because they think that actually it's someone else who decides what compliance is. And if it's not written within that box and it's not a tick the box sort of endeavor, then they will make compliance related errors.
Thank you, Dr. Dinin. Very interesting insights. Hybrid work, I just wrote, is cultural. Just like as Dr. Lay said, digital transformation is cultural. The same thing said by Mr. Tawari. Thank you very much. We have run out of time. Please allow me to express our gratitude to the presenters and panelists. I was going to say for imparting experiences and lessons and insights, but I think I'd rather say thank you for giving us the list of things that the Asian Bankers Association should be focusing over the next 12 months. Very relevant, touching, insightful comments. Thank you very much. All this will prepare our attendees not just to go through this continuing COVID saga, but more importantly, for taking advantage of the new opportunities and facing the emerging challenges. This is Eugene Acevedo, your session chairman. Thank you and good afternoon and good evening.